Good afternoon. On behalf of the California Technology Agency, I'd like to welcome you all to the first of the 6 public meetings regarding NextGen 911 in California. I'm Karen Wong. I'm the Deputy Director, Public Safety Communications Office. Today's meeting is being taped and will be posted on the California Technology Agency website, just to let everybody know. The purpose of the public meeting regarding NextGen 911 is to engage and encourage stakeholders and the public to provide input and share future expectations of NextGen 911. The Public Safety Communications Office completed the 911 strategic plan in July 2010, and we just recently completed the NextGen 9-1-1 Roadmap. First and foremost, I want to say that the current 911 system is not broken. The current system has been in place for over 40 years, and we're moving to NextGen 911 due to the advancements of technology. NextGen 911 will provide the ability to accept multimedia data, text, messaging, video, and photo, improve interoperability, and 911 call routing. It is important as we move forward that we understand stakeholder and public expectations. Our panel members today are Ryan Doolin, Chief, California 911 Emergency Communications. Ryan joined the Public Safety Communications Office as Chief over the 911 program in October 2010. Chief Reginald Chappelle, a 25-year veteran of the California Highway Patrol. Chief Chappelle is currently assigned to the CHP's Information Management Division as Chief Information Officer. Retired City of Folsom Police Chief Sam Spiegel. Chief Spiegel is a member of the 911 Advisory Board and has over 30 years of experience in law enforcement. Shasta County Sheriff Tom Bosanko, good. Sheriff Bosanko has over 31 years in law enforcement with the Shasta County Sheriff's Office. Redding Fire Chief Kevin Kreitman. Chief Kreitman has over 30 years experience in fire services. He was the fire chief in Oregon for 10 years and has been in the Redding Fire Chief since 2008. Today's agenda includes 5 presentations relating to NextGen 911, as well as provide an opportunity for public comment. Since these meetings are limited to 3 hours, the following are the rules of engagement for today's meeting. Each of the 5 presentations will be limited to 10 minutes. There'll be a 4 minutes for questions by the panel, as well as response by the presenters. After the presentations conclude, we'll take a 15-minute break and resume for public comment. Public comments will be limited to 3 minutes. Anyone who wishes to provide public comments must sign up in advance, so please be sure to sign up with Judy Quesada or Paul Dumas. And if Judy and Paul could raise their hands. Okay, please sign up in advance with them. And before we get going, I'd like to check with the panel members if there are any questions or comments before we begin. Okay, I'd like to introduce our first presenter, Tom Jeffers, Vice President with OnStar.
Good afternoon. I just want you to think back to the last time you heard one of those radio commercials from OnStar where there is a crash, everything is black, you don't know where you are, and then all of a sudden you hear the voice of an angel saying, "This is OnStar, how can I help you?" The technology behind OnStar, which we call automatic crash response, has actually been around for nearly 15 years. It started off initially with just a voice activated by a crash that deployed the airbags, and it has moved much further. So what I'd like to do in the few minutes here is give you an overview of what telematics in general, and there are 2 primary players, OnStar and ATX, on how we go to business. So, should I just click here?
see them.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Whoop. This is very sensitive. Okay. So what I wanted to do is give you a few stats. This is just from OnStar's perspective. Just for perspective too, we interact with the public, our customers, every second of every day, 24/7, 365. In general, it's also helpful to understand that in terms of automatic crash response, that's where the car is hit. The car actually calls OnStar to tell us that the vehicle has been a crash, because you may not be able to find your cell phone in the car. You may not even be able to think about what to do in a crash. 24,000 times on average annually. In the state of California, nearly 2,000 times. Other emergency services, there's actually a red button also that you can press in the vehicle for emergency services. That happens 120,000 times in the course of a year. You're having a heart attack, or somebody in your car is, and you need to get help. In addition, one of the things we're very proud of is that about 75,000 times a year, somebody presses the red button and say, I have spotted a wildfire, I'm in California, and I have no idea where I am. And because of the precise GPS location we have exactly from where the key press was done, we can provide that information directly to 911 to be able to help them send the right services. As you can see, there are a number of other things we do, and in general, just for perspective, we have 5.8 million customers in the US and Canada right now. These are paying customers, as well as about 365,000 active subscribers in California. Oops. As I mentioned before, the two primary providers of telematics in the United States and Canada are OnStar and ATX. As you can see, OnStar has it through GM products, which would be Chevrolet, Cadillac, Buick, and GMC. We also provide it for Saab. One thing that we've just announced within the last couple of weeks is that we'll be able to provide an OnStar mirror that you can buy at a retail outlet and put on any vehicle, so that any vehicle in America essentially could have OnStar. Put it in the Camry, put it in the Ford. In addition, ATX provides services for a number of other car companies, including Toyota, the Lexus brand as well. Hyundai was just announced, and they'll be starting to provide services later this year, and BMW. And I think it's very important to note that the reason why OnStar and ATX are actually sharing this podium through the course of these 6 discussions is because we believe that our mission is the same when we interface with the first responder community. We will go exactly the same way to 911. We work on it together. We sponsor the same events. We are side by side sitting with Nina and Abco, the 911 representatives, every time we go out. It is so critical that you don't have to try to figure out multiple ways of going to business. We could do it one way, and we work very closely together. And Gary Wallace will be presenting at some of the other forums. In terms of some of ATX's numbers, you can see that they have about 1.3 million subscribers in US and Canada, and doing the similar kinds of things that OnStar does. So let's take a look at what happens. Here, as I described initially, there's a car crash. What happens next? Data is immediately sent to what we call a TSP, that's a telematic service provider, that's OnStar, through the cellular network that's already established. So you basically have a cell phone in the vehicle that makes the call out to our call center, not to the PSAP, but to our call center, and we know the exact location of where this happened is because of the GPS technology that's in the vehicle. So the person receives that call. We have voice communication, that's the angel I was referring to earlier, and the data from the crash is actually sent to our call center. So that's primary direction of force, multiple impacts, the actual delta velocity of the crash, if the seat belts on the passenger driver were engaged, and potentially rollover, a whole bunch of pieces of data. We've been able to do this for at least 7 years already. So we provide that information, but as you notice in this, we then make an immediate call to public safety answering point, a PSAP, or the 911 office. However, it's only voice, except for potentially if it's stage 2, that they'll be able to have both the GPS location, lat long, as well as a callback telephone number for OnStar, as well as a case number. But in some places in America, it's only voice. But none of the additional pieces of data that we already have about that would be very helpful possibly in terms of how to dispense the right type of services. So the PSAP then dispatches the appropriate services, whether it's EMS, fire, maybe it's a helicopter, or the law enforcement community. That's the current situation. One of the things that the Centers for Disease Control, working with NHTSA, National Highway Transportation Safety Agency, as well as the leading researchers in trauma in the United States have found, and they published in this journal, is that if we can use all of this additional data that we can glean from the car from a crash, we are going to be able to have a probability of predicting the likelihood of a severe injury. We can decrease the amount of time it takes to get the right first responders to the scene. We can assist in the field triage as well as transport decisions. In other words, if you know that because of the way that crash happened, it was from the left side with a delta velocity of 60, and there were multiple impacts, and they weren't wearing their seatbelt, we know in 1 second that that person has to go to trauma hospital immediately, because the severity of their injuries, as defined by the Centers for Disease Control, will most probably have an ISS, or injury severity score, of greater than 15. We can be able to help them know that. It's not just a regular call. We have all of this information. In the future, you'll have the vehicle, you'll have that same, using same cell network, the same GPS information, the same call still comes into our call center, both voice and data. But what changes here is that all of this crash data is then transmitted as well via data link to the PSAP. So crash direction, crash speed, as I mentioned before, seatbelt uses multiple impacts and rollover. And we can assign a prediction of the probability of severe injury. And the way we have been talking about it amongst ATX and OnStar is we'll say there's a high probability of a severe injury. A whole bunch of education will have to take place with the first responder community as well as with fire and police to make certain everybody knows what that means. But we will be working on test cases of actually showing in deployments in various places in America about how that has changed the decision making. That report that I just mentioned from the CDC is also based upon research done recently at Johns Hopkins, which said that if in a severe crash, the person in the crash is sent to a level 1 trauma center if they have a severe injury versus going to the community hospital and then being transported to the level 1 trauma center, there's a 25% higher probability that they will live. In medical science, there is nothing that will make as significant of a difference in terms of final outcomes, life or death, than they believe using this data to determine how to dispatch the right resources to the right hospital in the right time. As I mentioned before, voice and data will go between the PSAP as well as injury severity prediction as well as the data, so that the right level of service can be dispatched and get to the person who is in a crash so that they can get help. We see this only as saving people's lives, and I'm very proud to be part of this industry and this technology, and since I haven't seen it already, I want to make certain it's clear. OnStar and ATX do not have a business at all if it weren't for our interactions with the first responder community. We work very hard to provide training and insight to them about our services, and we glean a great deal from them in terms of what are the needs for them. And so we've developed many services based upon that, including this service right here. That's all I have. I'd love to take any questions that you might have, and I also will be around for more discussion.
Mr. Jeffers, I have a question. In one of your earlier slides, you talked about being able to put a rearview mirror in non-GM cars so that they would have OnStar service. Does that just allow them to contact OnStar, or would it also give crash dynamics? How would you know how many seatbelts were deployed if it's a rearview mirror?
The new service will not connect into the bus, the electrical bus of these other vehicles of a Camry. However, we will have a capability within it to detect the signs or the pulse of a crash and therefore be able to do an automatic crash response. But we will not be able to have all the additional pieces of data that we have with an embedded system. It's just because there are all these sensors all around the car that we have that send into the normal system. But still, it will be helpful with the automatic crash response.
I'm real curious. I'm looking at a growing industry that obviously has had tremendous benefit for the motoring public throughout the United States. I'm also looking at a huge increase in the number of calls that are coming into PSAPs. And this seems to be one of the areas, at least in California, that there are no settlement funds that are garnered from the services that OnStar and ATX are charging to their client customers. Has there been any consideration as to what participation financially there would be from OnStar and ATX in aiding in this integration and somehow mitigating the additional call load that we're seeing?
Just to take a step back, one of the things I think you saw is that when we place the call into the PSAP, we've already triaged the call. We already know that it's a verified emergency. And based upon our statistics, anywhere between 4 out of 5 calls that we receive are not calls that we actually have to push to 911. So in fact, from our statistics, it would appear that the greater the number of folks that have OnStar or ATX kinds of services, we will triage the calls. And so if it's a cat up the tree, it doesn't need to go on the high priority 911 line. It can actually be taken care of for the less priority line. In terms of helping financially with the 911 system, OnStar through our hands-free calling, anytime somebody uses hands-free calling and purchases minutes through it, we actually contribute to the E911 fees in California.
There are no more questions. Thank you very much for your
Thank you.
presentation. I'd like to introduce Jeremy Smith, Senior Consultant with L.R. Kimball and Lead Consultant on the State of California's Next Generation 911 Roadmap.
Good afternoon, everybody. I can control this from up here. All right. My name is Jeremy Smith, and I'm a Senior Consultant with L.R. Kimball, a company that has helped the state of California recently develop their NG9-1-1 Roadmap, which some of you may have seen. In addition to working with California, we've been fortunate enough to work with several different states across the country and are involved in a lot of different activities related to NextGen 911. And so that sort of gives us a unique perspective on what's going on at the national level. And we thought that it would be useful to share some of that information just to give you a little bit of perspective on the rest of the world. Ryan Doolin will be talking a little bit about California specifically immediately after this. You heard Karen mention this morning that 911 is not broken, and I think it's important to note that. Sometimes folks might get the impression that 911 is broken, because it can't text or you can't receive text for 911, et cetera. And that isn't true. 911 is not broken. But it's important to know that 911 really wasn't designed with those kinds of technologies in mind. It was primarily designed to receive 3-digit dialing from landline. The addition of technologies like cell phones, and Ryan will actually probably have some statistics to show you the number of wireline calls versus wireless calls in California and how that scale is tipped a little bit, or quite a bit. But with the addition of wireless calls, there were some modifications that needed to be made to the network to identify location and things like that of the caller. The introduction of voice over IP, your Vonages of the world and things of that nature, also required some modifications. Again, this is sort of the square peg round hole. But the system as it designs today, the underlying technology of the 911 system, really isn't extensible to support the new types of technologies that my almost 16-year-old daughter wants to use to communicate with 911. Texting, video, and those kinds of capabilities, and even some of the capabilities that the gentleman from OnStar talked about, the ability to send that data directly to the PSAP. The underlying 911 network really doesn't provide a means for us to support that. And so there is a need to update the legacy 911 network with what we're calling Next Generation 911. So what is Next Generation 911? Well, there's a lot of different definitions of Next Generation 911, and for our purposes here, Next Generation 911 is an open standards-based system that really is designed to allow just about any type of device to communicate with 911. Now, any device is kind of a broad statement. Obviously, there needs to be some sort of parameters and standards in place that define what types of devices, how they communicate. But the theory is any device, any time, as you'll hear the National Emergency Number Association, or NENA, talk about. A lot of times folks will make the mistake of thinking that NextGen is just a network, that all we need to do is put an IP-enabled network in place and connect all the PSAPs together, and voila, we have NextGen 911. And while a network is very important to NextGen 911, it's not the only thing. In fact, if you look at the graph to the left, you'll see that the circle on the inside is some of the technology, whether it's your applications that need to be updated to support Next Generation 911, or your security, which will now need to be updated because we're all connected together now, and so we have security risks. Your network, that's kind of the easy part, frankly. The outside circle, though, that's the more difficult piece. You know, the fact that OnStar and ATX can deliver that information to the PSAP is an exciting kind of capability, but what do those call takers do with that information? How do they process that information? How do they determine what exactly they need to do with that when all they're used to doing is just taking a 911 phone call? Understanding the operational impact is critical. Understanding the governance, or how decisions get made when you now have multiple 911 call-taking centers, multiple PSAPs connected together, a fire station, a highway patrol facility, and the local sheriff's department. 3 different governmental entities. Who makes decisions, and how do those decisions get made in this model? How does everybody ensure that we're protected? Governance is certainly one of the issues that can certainly be very sticky. And there are a lot of other concerns. But Next Generation 911 needs to contain all of those functions that we're used to, those rock-solid functions that we're used to in the legacy 911, while allowing for those new features that we need in our new environment today. There is no formal mandate. There's no law, there's no requirement that says NextGen has to be implemented. But consumer expectations, my almost 16-year-old daughter, who I was teaching to drive the other day, that's a different story, but they're the folks that are driving this adoption. Certainly technological advances are driving this as well. The capabilities like you see from OnStar and ATX, the capabilities in the cellular devices, in the phones that we see, there's an app for that, right? There's always an app for everything. All of those capabilities are driving us towards Next Generation 911. I think it's important to note, though, that Next Generation 911 is still in development. The standards are still being developed today. There are no fully deployed Next-Gen 911 systems yet. There are partially deployed systems. Some folks, and I'll talk a little bit about this in a minute, have started to deploy various elements and are in various stages of the planning process. Recently, the FCC released a notice of inquiry asking the public for comment, and so you started to see some activity at the national level as well. Many states, and I'll give you kind of an update on this in just a second, are already creating their strategic plans, their roadmaps, their security plans, their operations plans, the plans on what to do with their data, which is so critical in determining things like location in a Next Generation 911. Next Generation 911 networks, those networks that are capable of supporting it, those IP-enabled networks that will be used to communicate, to put all this data and information on, can start to be implemented as well. And I'm hoping that you guys can see these okay, but there's a couple of maps here, and I wanted to just kind of show you. As I mentioned, we have the opportunity to work with a lot of different states and have kind of a national perspective. And we'll take the one here on the left, the NextGen 9-1 planning slide. You can see that the states that are in green are states that have started to do some sort of planning across the United States. And you can see that California is also a part of that. The states in white are those that have not started that process yet. If you look at the slide to the right there, the started to deploy, these are states that have started to deploy some element of NextGen 9-1-1, be it a network, be it a partial network, be it some sort of test bed or grant project or something like that. And you'll see that California is in kind of that lime green. That's because a sub-state has been, a portion, not in the entire state, but just a sub-state has been deployed with the Northeast Grant Project, which is actually happening up here in this part of the state. And you can see that there are several states that while they've started the planning process, they have not started to deploy anything yet. So sometimes folks will ask me, is California behind or ahead of everybody else? And I would say that you're right in the middle. Okay? You're not ahead, you're not behind. You're right in the middle. I think that this slide is probably the most telling slide, and that's the fact that nobody in the country has implemented a fully NextGen 9-1-1 deployment yet. Not yet. Now, who will be first? It'll probably end up being somebody like Rhode Island or Connecticut or something like that. It probably will not be California, but I get the sense that you guys probably won't be far behind here. So what are some other states doing? We could spend hours talking about a lot of the different things that states are doing. I thought that I would talk about two in particular and then just hit a highlight on a few other states in a minute. But Texas is a state that has been doing quite a bit on NextGen. They have gone so far as to release what's called a master plan, which is sort of their definition of NextGen 9-1-1 for their state. It describes the architectural model by which they are going to deploy NextGen. What they have chosen to do in Texas, for those of you that aren't familiar with the Texas environment, the way that the state of Texas handles 9-1-1 is based on regional groupings. There's a couple of different governmental entities that are used to segregate 9-1-1. There's a state 9-1-1 office in Texas which is responsible for only a portion of those, and then a bunch of the other organizations kind of do things on their own. They've managed to come to the table and for the most part get along and have created a design whereby there will be regional NextGen 9-1-1 networks, or what we call ESI nets, or emergency services networks, that will then be connected by a statewide network. And so they're pretty far down the planning process. If I had to pick a state that was the farthest along, I would probably say that it's Texas. That's probably the farthest along. Michigan has done quite a bit of work. They've conducted some research on existing networks that Michigan has in place. They've started to define their functional requirements. So what is going to define NextGen 9-1-1 in Michigan? They've started to define those requirements. They've done some cost studies to figure out how much it's going to cost to do NextGen in Michigan. Oregon is doing this right now, trying to figure out what it's going to cost to do NextGen in the state of Oregon. And they've started to put together their strategic plan or strategic report to lay out just how it's going to be constructed in the state of Michigan. A couple of other states, Minnesota has an IP-enabled network, Tennessee, and I'm just briefly hitting the highlights here with respect to time, but Tennessee has been integrating with another state network. You'll notice there's a theme of at least looking at existing state networks. Sunk cost has already been put into a state network in a lot of these places, and so they're finding that there's political will to at least examine those networks for suitability. They may not ultimately end up using those networks, but they're wanting to be prudent with their funds and take a look at those networks as they exist today. Colorado started the planning process. Washington has completed the planning process and has started some pilot projects. So again, while there is no formal mandate for NextGen 9-1-1, the consumers are driving it. The folks that have OnStar in their car, they're saying, hey, we have all this information, why can't the PSAPs receive it? My daughter says, why can't I text 911, Dad? And it's a technical explanation, which she tunes out pretty quick. But you know, this technology is moving along fairly rapidly, and it is time to migrate our legacy 911 environment to NextGen. So hopefully that kind of helped to give you a national picture, a quick view of the national landscape, and I know Ryan's going to talk about the California landscape here in a minute. That's all I have. Do I have any questions or comments?
Mr. Smith, I have two questions. One is, at a national level, is there anyone setting the data standards, or is it simply he who builds it first is the standards? Do you have any information in that regard?
Yes, there are some organizations like the National Emergency Number Association, or NENA, that have been working to define standards for various components of NENA, and there are other organizations like that that do that. I still think, though, that there will be a little bit of the he who builds it first. Will probably, you know, when you got something built, sometimes it's harder to unbuild it. And so I think that there's a little bit of the standard stuff going, well, there definitely is standard stuff going on, but I still think there's an opportunity for somebody to plant that flag, if you will. Good question.
Thank you. And my second question had to do with one of your slides, the slide with the pictures of the United States that showed who had started planning and who has started deploying. I don't know if it's an error on the slide or if I'm reading it incorrectly, but I'm looking at Illinois, and it shows that they have not started planning. But then under deployment, it shows that they partially deployed. So I'm wondering if they're deploying without planning, or if that was just...
It's not a mistake.
It could happen.
It's not a mistake, but and I won't comment on that part of it. But they have, what they've started to do in southern Illinois, they've started to deploy an IP network there, and they're in process. So by our definition of what we are defining planning, we didn't consider that, but you could probably make a case that there's some planning that went into that. So, and it's no offense to Illinois. Good question.
Much as the chief commented on earlier with the call loads coming into the call centers, it's all going to also create more of a demand to probably capture the text messaging, the photos, digital photos that are coming in, and of course then being able to archive those for the records for X period of time if they become public information or evidence in the case, depending on what information has transpired there. And I could see it having a huge cost for the agencies that have the dispatch centers. And of course the next question, and you may not be able to answer it, is where does the funding come from to support the infrastructure for next generation 911?
Well, I think that you hit upon a very interesting and important component, and that's with the, you know, with all of this additional data that we have. It's great that we have it, but we do need to figure out how to store that data because, as you mentioned, Freedom of Information Act comes into play, and then certainly things like, you know, it could be subpoenaed, it could be part of a court case, there may be other laws and regulations pertinent to a specific state that come into play. So yes, you're absolutely right. Not only does that information have to be retained, but it also has to be secured, which implies an entirely different set of problems, all of which result in cost. I don't have a good answer for you or anybody else on the cost other than to acknowledge that it is a problem, and it's one that is not going to be difficult to solve.
Architecture. You talked about the first, he who built it, they set the standard. Is there something, and my nomenclature is not correct, please let me know what it is. Is the architecture that is being looked at open, or are we seeing proprietary silos of technology starting up?
It's another good question. One of the key philosophical precepts behind NextGen is that it be open, standards-based, to allow for, you know, the maximum type of flexibility. The stuff that the National Emergency Number Association, or NENA, has been doing is and does fit that criteria of being open, standards-based, flexible, and not built into a silo. there are other different things that are going on around the place that you know, arguably could fall into one category or another, but I know that what Nina is doing does fit that criteria.
So in a similarity to doing something like that, we do that to 25 to open up the interoperability, so to
Right.
speak, to different vendors.
Exactly, yeah. And you know, what Nina has done, they've been working with other standards bodies to raise the level of their standards to something like an ANSI type standard that would receive national accreditation, international accreditation. Mhm.
Okay, if there are no more questions.
Thank you.
Our next presenter, thank you very much, Jeremy. Our next presenter is Ryan Doolin.
Do I just touch it? How do I? There, okay. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm dealing with a little bit of a cold, so I do apologize. Jeremy talked about a little bit on the national perspective of next generation. And what I want to do is really give you a perspective of California, what we are doing here in the state today, along with planning for the future for next generation. I want to be clear that there is a sense of urgency on the state of California to collect all the comments. We don't have all the answers today. And that's what we're trying to set up these public meetings, to collect some of the information and do the fact finding that's going to be necessary to really plan a system that our citizens can all depend on as we transition into next gen. Some of the stats, you know, Jeremy talked about California not being ahead or behind, but in fact, we're not Rhode Island, and we're not your mom and dad's 911 system anymore. We are taking on and servicing 37 million residents statewide. We're covering about 163,000 square miles of state that span all different geographical areas. This office oversees 465 PSAPs that operate in local different jurisdictions across the state and have different local governing bodies that they report to. We answer about 23.8 million calls, 911 calls in California in 2010, and of those 16.6 million were wireless. So we do see a trend across the state of people dropping landlines and moving to more mobile technology, as well as just having the ability to move across the state. So we need to make sure that we're getting those calls to the PSAP the first time that they come through our system. On any given day, there are about 65,000 911 calls, and that gives you the magnitude of all of our dispatchers and first responders, what they're dealing with on a daily basis. There's a lot of calls coming into the system, and I appreciate OnStar and ATX triaging of those calls and making sure that those emergency calls are the only ones that are getting into the 911 system, so I do appreciate that. In addition to all the call statistics, we translate over 91 languages statewide throughout our demographics. So we have translators across the state that help our dispatchers get the services to our citizens. The current California 911 environment, as Jeremy said, it does not allow for processing of calls of new technologies. We really have no way to accept multimedia, such as text messages, videos, and photos. We are unable to efficiently transfer calls when the volume of callers exceed the available resources, so we have no mechanism to dynamically route calls to other dispatch centers that might have available dispatchers to answer those call volumes and to keep people from getting busy signals across the state and the system. And we do have the ability or the need to increase the accuracy of location information. And that location information is really, again, used to route the calls to the appropriate PSAP the first time, so we don't have issues with transferring calls, and we can get those emergency services to the citizen as quickly as possible. Some elements, current NextGen 911 efforts that are underway. We issued in July 2010 our strategic plan, and we specifically called out Next Generation 911 as being one of our key areas that we want to tackle. We find it essential to collaborate and really reach out to our stakeholders to gain input, as well as have communication channels out so we can not just push information, but we can actually gather information. And one essential component is going to be our public outreach and education, is why should folks and how should folks interact with the system, the 911 system across the state. In December 2010, we are gaining traction these last couple of months, and we conducted a statewide PSAP survey to really collect information on the top issues, obstacles, and concerns of our dispatch centers, as well as these public meetings will give us input into planning for NextGen. And one of our big initiatives was publishing our proposed California Next Generation 9-1-1 Roadmap. And that really is our tactical plan that takes our strategic ideas and key elements and gives us a plan to roll out across the state. And in February, obviously this month and next month, we'll be conducting the 6 statewide public meetings to, again, gather information and really complement our roadmap. So one of those key areas are just to validate everything that we've laid out for Next Generation is going to be something that we want to tackle, and also to make sure that we haven't left any gaps that need to be addressed. One of our first initiatives to kind of take on NextGen is really a current project that I'm proud to really talk about, and that is our Enhanced E911 grant project. It is a federal grant project that is being funded by the feds with state matching funds of $4.3 million. And the location is up here in the northeast part of California. We have 11 counties and a total of 37 PSAPs that we're going to be moving over to the IP-hosted backbone. In December 2010, we transitioned 3 PSAPs to that IP-hosted solution, being Oroville PD Police Department, Paradise Police Department, and Gridley Police Department. So we're starting the year off quite well positioned with NextGen. And the map kind of depicts the area that we're focusing on. This is really a proof of concept, which is way in later phases of our roadmap, but because of the grant fundings, we wanted to take advantage of those opportunities and start proofing a lot of the capabilities in the IP world in our current system today. A couple of other current projects that we're in discussions and preliminary stages are the Imperial County hosted solution, where we're also looking at an IP hosted backbone, Ventura County, the Pasadena Regional Integrated Next Generation Project, as well as Mendocino County. One of the things that I forgot to mention is in the roadmap, we are really looking at doing a thorough analysis of the key components and some of the questions that the panel board members had. We're going to be looking at regulatory, legislative, funding mechanisms such as the CETNA fund and how it's to be used during NextGen, the technology components with open architecture and also the proprietary software that may be out there. And I would imagine that it's not going to be a one solution fits all. It's probably going to be a multi-pronged approach in most of those areas. We're all looking at operations from an enterprise perspective. As we transition to NextGen, it's really going to start looking more from an enterprise view across the state. In some areas, we're going to have to establish statewide policies and procedures, as well as keep the local operations right at the dispatch center. And one issue that keeps on being raised is the security mechanism, is making sure that all of our data is secure and protected, as well as the data retention issues that are going to be popping up for prosecution across the state. What we're looking at is in California, post NextGen, is we really want to accomplish that many types of communication devices can be used. We don't know what those are today, but we are wanting to implement voice, text, and video information in our 911 system. We want to make sure that data sharing is available across our PSAPs and with our first responders. We want to make sure that callers routed are automatically based on location of the individual. Forwarding capabilities extend beyond local geographic boundaries, and enhanced backup capabilities are going to be in the system. And lastly, the PSAP is able to control call congestion treatment, including dynamic rerouting of callers. And what that is based on business rules, we want the system to automatically transfer those calls and distribute the call volume across our available resources. So I encourage you all, I really want to make sure that the public engages themselves while we collect information and ask for input. Make sure that the public participates as well as industry, and the opportunity to share your input at the public meetings, as well as submit your comments in writing by March 18th at the email address. Our office is going to be collecting all this information, and in a couple of months we'll be producing a report on all the information that we gather from these public meetings, and it will be available for review and comment as well. So that concludes my presentation. You guys have any questions?
Ryan, with the information that you're looking at, the video and the data and all those other forms that will be coming into the 911 systems, is there, looking at statewide, a system to deploy that to units in the field so that we have a standardized system, and maybe being able to cut down and provide additional information such as automatic vehicle location for dispatching and the type of stuff that really would become helpful in the field as well?
You know, I guess my idea is really about how the MDCs, the mobile digital computers, were kind of rolled out across the state. Once you have the IP backbone, it really opens the door and the framework for all of this data to be shared. So I think we're going to go through the same kind of iteration with the 911 system. Right now we are laying the framework, which is the IP backbone. What we do after that and the capabilities that are going to be there, we're going to have to reach out to law enforcement and the first responders and decide how we want to share that data and who needs to have that data and what needs to really come into a dispatch center and what type of information can go directly to a first responder. So we're really laying the framework right now, and we're, you know, as we roll out our roadmap, which is that tactical plan, I hope that we are going to answer some of those questions. But the key element being is that the first responders need to be engaged. So as the state office starts to, you know, have focus groups and stuff, I'm going to ask that, you know, the fire and the law enforcement and emergency medical groups really reach out to our office and get engaged and participate.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Ryan, you spoke about current devices. Are you or other entities working with providers such as cellular phones for the smartphones, computer providers, and the technology groups to work with Next Generation 911 on whatever the next form of communication may be, so that it has that software capabilities to interact with that? Because usually, as you know, technology is changing so rapidly. Is it going to be next generation? Is it going to be behind the curve already by the time it's implemented?
Right, that's a good question. Like, is it going to be next millennium or something else that's going to be rolling out? You know, those are good questions. I just took my office in October of last year, so I'm trying to get some traction. But in January, I did construct a technology work group that's made up of my office, the advisory board, and some other areas within California. And I think we are looking at it to not be product, or actually to be product agnostic and look at the actual capabilities, so that when new devices pop up, we will actually be able to either say that they can utilize the 911 system, or it's not appropriate for them to use 911, and then see if that's something that we want to then entertain. So I do have a technology work group right now that's going to be starting up and looking at all of these issues for new technologies that are coming in. Right now, they're waiting at the gate. So all of the application developers, they really are wanting to become engaged in 911, and we have to give them a channel to then get into the process. Does that answer your question? Good.
Hey, Ryan. For the counties that are participating in the hosted solution, is the hosted portion of that network the movement of those calls, or will data at rest sit on hosted servers? And I ask because I have a concern about either chain of custody for any calls that may turn into a court proceeding, or just CLETS data, for example, sitting on hosted servers.
Right now, most of those areas we're in preliminary discussion, so we're just in the planning. The ones that have rolled out in the northeastern area, we have a group working on those issues, and part of the hosted solution is to see how that data is shared amongst the participating PSAPs. So they are going to be dealing with all of those issues and what the new IP infrastructure is going to bring.
Okay, and I had one other question. If I remember the Enhanced 911 Act accurately, those funds were for 5 years, 2006 to 2011. Do you have, or does the state have, a steady funding source for rolling out Next Generation 911, or are you relying on the SETNA fund to do that? And if you are relying on the SETNA fund to do that, can it support maintaining the existing system and building out a Next Gen 911 system?
You know, as part of our roadmap, we want to identify the funding source for Next Gen. I don't have an answer for that, but we are currently using grant funding and state matching funds for the Northeastern project to roll out the IP infrastructure. And in other areas, as we roll out, we'll have to assess whether the SETNA fund or other funding mechanisms going to be the most appropriate means for that. And as we currently, we're at the lowest threshold of collecting the SETNA funds statewide. During our assessment, we'll be looking to see if that funding is going to be sufficient enough for Next Gen.
Ryan, has there even been a cost estimate or guesstimate what it would take to implement Next Generation 911 statewide to all the dispatch centers?
You guys are rocking and rolling. Actually, you know, I have the team right now doing a rough cost of magnitude for Next Gen 911. We don't have anything published right now, but we are going through, you know, collecting that information. And L.R. Kimball is actually our consultant firm that is gathering the information, and we will be sharing that as the data is collected. But I am working on that right now.
Thank you.
One more, Ryan.
Karen had the same question, so she wants those numbers.
I'm sorry, one more question. You know, as far as the timeline goes, I know there's a lot of moving parts for Next Generation 911. You know, you look at the infrastructure, you might be looking at you know, rolling out mobile applications or some way of getting that data to centers and connecting to public and private centers. Is there a timeline where we expect that for what is now defined as Next Generation 911, that it would be fully implemented in California? Is this a 2-year effort, 5-year effort, 10-year effort?
You know, I think we're going to do this in many stages, and I don't know if we're ever going to be finished with NextGen because of the new application, so it's just what your definition of when it's going to be actually rolled out. But we have a sense of urgency. So we want to get this IP backbone implemented in the state of California as soon as possible. Those technologies are out there today. We want to be able to accommodate those. I don't have an exact timeline. The roadmap, the proposed roadmap does lay out those different phases that we're going to be taking on, but we don't have a definite endpoint that we're going to get to. But I think the last phase of the roadmap, I believe, is 2015. But we anticipate, because of, we want this rolled out, we'll be doing a lot of the efforts in parallel. So you could see different capabilities roll out in different areas before that end date. So it's really hard to say. We're going to try to do these not in a waterfall method, but as we understand and the regulatory and funding mechanisms are in place, and if there's any legislative changes, then we'll be tackling each of those capabilities as they roll out. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay.
Ryan, if I could, I think that two of the things that you touched on, particularly the funding mechanism and the rollout, I'm hoping that we can learn from some of the things we've done in the past that we've done better than others. The integration of GIS features into into our calls in the comm centers by providing incentive to the PSAPs to take on cellular 911 and that. We need to look at a different mechanism of moving people, whether it's kicking and screaming into the future or going along skipping happily to the next technology. I would caution, and I know that I'm preaching to the choir, but certainly to our consultant, that this is going to be a very delicate balance as we look at, excuse me, as we look at the magnitude of, let's just say, the infrastructure. Put a price tag on that and then say, okay, gee, now we've got to fund this. When we're looking at the financial state, or the financial situation of our state, we've had a trigger mechanism in the Setna funds for years and can't seem to get the intestinal fortitude to pull the trigger so that we can get additional monies and start putting that aside. I think that'll be a very, very integral part of helping fund this. But if we cannot succinctly articulate the phase of NextGen that is the first bite out of the apple, that probably being infrastructure, what it is and what it costs, we'll never get to that argument. And my bigger fear is that the Setna fund will eventually be looked at as an offsetting revenue of some other solution to state budget balancing. So the sooner we can get to where we're at with this number that I know Karen's waiting on, and that we can bring our communities of constituents together to have a like voice of where we have to go, I think the better, because the longer it waits, the more peril that Setna fund sits in.
Yeah, I think that's a good comment, as well as making sure that the first responders provide those comments of what is needed for NextGen. That will help us present the case of the essential services that are going to be part of this new 911 system. It's a have to. It's not a nice to have. And again, going back to some of those hosted solutions, we are looking at efficient way of using our money, so we're not wasting taxpayer dollars and the Setna fund dollars to replace equipment. So when they're up for replacement, we're making sure that our contract mechanisms and the equipment have the capabilities of NextGen. So we're not buying non-compliant NextGen type of equipment and then replacing it in a couple of years. We're making sure that that equipment is ready beforehand.
And I applaud that, and I think that's very good, but we have to keep in mind that part of the goal to do that last time as we're updating equipment and not going back to older equipment, trying to move people forward, at the same time came at a cost.
Right.
And we still have, unfortunately, agencies, some in major capital cities of the state, that are not taking cellular 911 because of staffing issues.
Right.
And so to the extent that we would withhold something like that is perilous in some regard to that agency, and at the same time is appropriate funding for setting monies to be used.
Right.
Ryan, if you could explain Setna funds so everybody understands what that is.
Well, hopefully I do.
Thank you.
Actually, it's the state emergency number fund, and what it is money that is collected on each one of the telephones throughout the state. The telephone companies collect that and ultimately goes to the Board of Equalization, and it's a set, I think it's half, yeah, someone might have to correct me, I think it's 0.5% of the total amount, and I don't know what the current total is, but Board of Equalization manages the fund, and then those funds are used to support the infrastructure and 911 for the state of California.
Okay, with no more questions, thank you, Ryan, very much.
Thanks.
And our next presenter is Joy Willis, Director, SHASCOM 911.
Morning, afternoon, isn't it? Afternoon, panel and guests. I'm here to, my name's Joy Willis. I'm the Director of SHASCOM 911. As Karen said, we're a consolidated PSAP. We take all of the 911 calls in 2 of the 3 major cities in this county and the entire county. I have about 23 years of 911 experience, and I'm here to present the PSAP perspective, which is really more questions and concerns than answers, I'm sorry to say, but that is what this meeting is all about, I believe. So Next Generation 911 means any device, anywhere, anytime. That's a lot. Real-time text, short message service, all of these various devices and other modes of communication. The analog gateway, for instance, is the gateway into what is currently 911 from VoIP. And VoIP is Voice over Internet Protocol, or telephone calls made via the Internet. That came upon us sort of as a surprise to some of us in the 911 industry. And just as a short little story, when we first heard that there was VoIP in Shasta County, I went ahead and did a little spoof. I called a provider, a VoIP provider, and pretended I wanted to order their service, which I guess was sort of deceitful, but I was curious. And I said to the salesperson, "And how is 911 going to work?" And the salesperson said, "You don't have to worry, 911 always works no matter what." So probably not, and that's why we're here today. That red phone up in the corner that you saw in the first slide, that was the way 911 originally was, of course. A 911 call just comes in and someone tells us what they need. The next thing we got was enhanced 911. In Shasta County, that was rolled out in about 1989, and then wireless. These particular enhancements to 911 were rolled out in a very deliberate way, in a very careful way through the state 911 office, and the result was excellent service and continued service, which is again what we're hoping for from this, from Next Generation. So we're looking at making sure that the funding is correct if we can. We're hopeful of that. Legislation, technology, security, education. We are concerned about that funding model. It is stable. The Setna Fund is terrific, but we doubt that it's going to carry all the things that we're going to need in a PSAP. We're going to have to upgrade the CPE, that's the customer premise equipment, the equipment in each 911 center, as was alluded to by Ryan. Also, besides the equipment, GIS is going to be more important than ever. We were given an incentive to take wireless by receiving GIS monies, but those monies, it's not a never-ending stream, and the PSAPs need to keep that GIS, that mapping maintained. So we are hoping that the maintenance and the continual upgrading of our mapping will continue. An expired map, an old map, is not useful to dispatch. If we're going to transition to the 911 system, we are interested in, again, all devices, then should we think pay, including, I don't believe pay-as-you-go phones at this time are paying into the Setna funds, and that's a large market, and that should be paying in. We're concerned about any kind of hardship that comes to local government. Again, GIS, my agency, for instance, doesn't have any more GIS funds, and yet we have to buy more licensing and upgrade our GIS. So we're hoping that that can change. Legislation, we really, really would like to have the type of legislation that Jeremy was alluding to. We think California should follow the NENA standard. We are worried about privacy concerns, and California's Constitution, of course, has the Public Records Act, which says if a public agency has access to data, they can be forced to provide it, even if it's not their own, as long as they check and as long as it's not part of an investigation or an ongoing evidence. So that makes it a little more dicey than some other states for hosted solutions. We had also heard that in a hosted solution that the actual tape where we tape evidence is, some of it is going to be stored on the hosted solution and some can be stored at the local PSAP. That's again an evidence concern and a security concern. We want the performance-based, and we want whatever is installed to be technologically agnostic, which is, I think, a terrific term. We just learned it last week at NENA, and it's talking about that every technology needs to fit in. The dispatcher should not be the one who says, oh, gee, if it's from this company, I need to push this button and do these 3 steps, and if it's from this company, I need to do something else. This information needs to transmit into our centers in a stream that is exactly the same, no matter who is sending it to us. We need to be able to do some sort of prioritization. We need to be able to actually filter if we can. In a dispatch perspective, every call is not quite as big of an emergency as the citizen might think. The dispatcher does not need to see the video of the barking dog. So we want to be able to actually filter that and not have that come into us automatically. We need to have that capability. We're concerned about traffic shaping and traffic policing. Those are terms that mean some calls, traffic policing would actually drop some calls. Not such a great idea. Traffic shaping means holding on to calls in queue until they're ready to go. And many of the PSAPs also are not all that crazy about the idea of distributing their 911 calls to another center. So we want to be very careful about that kind of concept. Security, of course. For instance, address spoofing. We've already had that come in. Address spoofing means someone deliberately and maliciously falsifies an address and falsifies calls in order to have, say, a SWAT team go out when they shouldn't. So we're hoping for some kind of safeguards and ability to identify that. We are very concerned about all of that sort of security. We think education is going to be key. Of course, the PSAP personnel are going to need to be educated. We don't trained on how to take all these calls, again, trained to, if we need to filter, trained as to when to pick up that video or that text, that still photo, who to send it to and when. That's quite a lot of additional training that was provided on E911, and we'll need that again. The first responders will also need training, and that's a cost as well. It seems to us that the first responders, the field units, will also need training. And as Sheriff Pasenko alluded to, there's a lot of storage for all of this extra space. Everyone knows about how your memory just degrades so fast, and how your memory is used up by text or video. And again, caller privacy, particularly with California's Public Record Act. Applications developers need to understand what's actually happening in the call center, and the fact that they can do it doesn't mean that they need to do it. Every single new technology might not be appropriate for the PSAP. We need to stick with our essential goal. And the public does, I think right now that that 911 is just magic, and that's good. It's great that they depend on it. It's great that they think that we can do anything, anytime. In fact, many of the public, through our quality control surveys, think that we actually respond. They think the dispatcher takes the call and then jumps in a police car and goes, and that's probably not the best use of resources. So we're going to need all of that education for the public too, that they are going to be able to send things, but they don't need to send a text of, as I said, the barking dog, that we'll be asking them when we need that video. We'll be able to say, okay, go ahead and send that to me. I'd like to see that. Next generation is not going to be the last generation, but our mission remains the same. It's very simple. The PSAP and the 911 dispatchers are the bridge between the citizen and seeking help and public safety professionals. Next generation needs to continue to be an actual benefit to the citizen and an enhancement of 911. The dispatcher is resourceful and dedicated. And next generation needs to be just an additional tool to keep us on that track. Thank you.
Joy, this may be for you or maybe for Ryan, but then I'm sure that it has to be looked at for interoperability, to where if the dispatch center is receiving a call, but it turns out that it's in CHP's jurisdiction, to be able to transfer that call with the new technology to CHP, or perhaps it's a CAL FIRE call, or in the event of a multi-jurisdictional critical incident. Up here we have wildland fires, in which CAL FIRE, CHP, maybe Reading Fire, and the Sheriff's Office, including police departments, may be working an incident together, and we'll have to be able to at least disseminate that information to various dispatch centers and vice versa as they're getting it. So I take it that's also in the plans?
Absolutely. I'm certain that is. Isn't that right?
Yeah.
Please say yes.
Yes. Anything you say, Joy. No, actually, it's part of that infrastructure. Again, the capability is going to be there. We are very interested in location accuracy, so we can get the call to the right place the first time. But also, when it goes out, you know, let's just say the citizen's reporting a particular emergency and it goes to a dispatch center. If that needs to go somewhere else, we're going to want that capability to transfer that call along with the supporting data elements. So again, the infrastructure is going to be there to support that.
You know, also we'll have to look at, many of the agencies have mobile communication centers. CHP, I call them the SUVs, but they're basically a mobile communication center as well, with multiple jurisdictional frequencies. We have a communications van as well, with a box in it, to a JPS box to do that. And so then this brings in dispatching as well, which we may have to add a piece of hardware and some software for those mobile communications units as well, so they can stay connected.
That'd be great. And Chief Kreitman was talking about the mobile data computers. The dispatchers will very much want to be able to send video and still photos, things like that, to the field units. So that we're very hopeful that's part of the plan as well. They'll want to see what we're seeing.
I was at an APCO roundtable last week, and that was one of the large areas of discussion that we had, was to make sure that we had transparency and interoperability to our first responders as well as to the PSAPs. And they're looking at a national level, a public safety communications network. We're also looking at that for the state. So we will be able to transfer those calls wireless to the actual folks that need them. Great. And we also partner with CalEMA, who has a lot of the mobile command centers.
Exciting times.
And one additional thing, I think Reggie had pointed that out, is just really the convergence of all of these IT capabilities are going to be there with radio, with 911 centers, with the mobile PCs in the dispatch, in the cars. Once that infrastructure is there, all that data could be shared. And we're really looking at the open architecture. So wherever we can and make sure that there's standards, that will enable all of these different technologies to operate together. And that's where you get the interoperability, not just with the 911 center, but also radio and so forth.
Ms. Willis, when you were at NENA and talking with your peers, was there concern that with next generation 911 would come a huge increase in the number of calls, or were they expecting that the number of calls will stay relatively static and the only thing that will change is how they're getting to the centers?
Not the number of calls so much, but the length of the call. That, for instance, in my center, we take about 84 seconds typically to receive and process a 911 call. But we also do emergency medical dispatching, which is new for us, so we're taking 2 or 3 minutes on a medical call. Well, if we're receiving video that we have to look for the bad guy or identify the wind, that's going to be, again, a lengthier process. So we do believe we'll need more call takers besides more training.
If there are no more questions, thank you very much. And our next presenter is Daryl Whitmer, Vice President of Strategic Relationships with Intrado.
Karen and panel, thank you very much. Happy Valentine's Day to all of you. If you hear the same thing 3 or 4 times in one day, does that make it fact? Does that make it true? Well, I hope so, because you've heard my presentation given several times by everybody that's given a presentation today. So I will do the best I can to make it a little more entertaining than I might have otherwise, since you've already seen all the data associated with it. If you take a look at the pictures that I have here, the police car, the fire truck, the communication center, which was the communication center. This thing is very sensitive. We believe that's Los Angeles circa late 1960s. 911, as we know it today, became a universal number in 1968. The first universal emergency services call for help number in the United States in 1968. The first 911 call, a basic 911 call, pick up the phone, dial 911, goes directly to some place to answer it that can provide you police, fire, EMS, whatever it might happen to be, was in Haleyville, Alabama in February of 1968. Before that, you picked up the phone, you dialed the operator, you told the operator what it was that you needed. Joy took some of those calls as a very, very, very young lady. A mere child. And she was actually given training on how to take those calls as a telephone company operator. We then went to basic 911. And basic 911 was, we send it someplace, we don't have any information with it, we don't have name, we don't have address, we don't have telephone number, but at least we got the call somewhere. And I'll go the right way. And then we went from basic 911 to enhanced 911. And you'll be interested to know that in 1974, Alameda County, California, was given one of the first federal grants to develop a 911 program. They were given $150,000 by the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration to develop enhanced 911. They went live with that 3 years later in 1977. They actually went live on July 9th, 1977, which was my birthday. Now, supposedly, the first enhanced 911 call was made on September 18, 1976. That was the day I got married. and my good friends in Chicago say that it was my wife calling asking, never mind. What is Next Generation 911? And I think it was said very well, it's not all about the technology. Next Generation 911 is about saving lives. It's about using those things that are out there available to us today to be able to deliver services to the public that you serve. Citizens' expectations. Recently, in June, July of this year, a sergeant in the public safety from the state of Delaware did a survey of 8 high schools. In those high schools, they were in Illinois, Pennsylvania, and Texas. 93% of the high school students said they used a cell phone, excuse me. 6% said a PDA, 1% said a landline. They were begging their mom and dads on hands and knees to get their cell phone, but they were still using the landline, and none were using any other type of device. But what's really critical to that is it dependent on the type of event that transpired, how the student would use the phone to contact emergency services. If it were a car accident, 93% would use voice, only 2% text. A house fire, 85% voice, 11% text. But an intruder with a gun, 87% would use text and only 6% would use voice. And that was no more obvious than it was at Virginia Tech. The young men and women at Virginia Tech could text their parents to say goodbye, but they couldn't text 911 for help. That, ladies and gentlemen, is something that we have to solve, and solve quickly. These look like normal high school students, but guess what? They're not. They're part of the deaf, hearing impaired, and speech impaired community. They don't use the iPhone, the smartphone, the texting as a fun thing to do. It is their tool. It is their method of communicating, their method of reaching out for help. And today, we can't help them. Next Generation 911 technology. We talked about the fact that the IP backbone is there today. It exists. It is being used every day across many applications that are just as mission critical, or perhaps not just as, but are mission critical applications on the same par with 911. They're used for the financial community, they're used by the Department of Defense, they're used by the medical community. IP is a proven technology that is being used every day. 911 is an application, a very specific application, a very critical application that is being developed to reside on that backbone. The IP backbone is in place today. When we talk about, and Ryan mentioned it, all of the folks out there that are chomping at the bit to develop new applications, we really have opened the door for 911 where it now becomes the iPhone apps for public safety. People that have never, really smart people that have never thought about developing anything for 911 now see that they can go out and develop things that can reside on that platform and develop services to public safety. It's our responsibility as industry, it's your responsibility as public safety to make certain that we want all of those, that we have a way to certificate those to make certain that they are things that we want to have come into public safety. But there are going to be so many of them, it's unbelievable. Have any of you seen, about 3 weeks ago, Bones? I love Bones. Bones did an episode on ShotSpotter, where ShotSpotter, an application that uses microphones to detect shots fired, was used to help solve a crime. ShotSpotter can be integrated into the public safety system, into the 911 system, where we can deliver that information with a call. So that depending on what you know about that call, you can let a first responder know before they go to a call that there have been shots fired within so many meters, within so many minutes. Protect the first responder. One of the most important jobs that we have. The future of next generation, and Joy said, her first slide said what my last slide was going to say, and that is any device, anytime, anywhere can request help, and we, as public safety, will have the ability to determine what help is needed and get the appropriate help to the appropriate place at the appropriate time. Are there challenges and opportunities? Absolutely. We've talked about all of them here. We've talked about funding. We've talked about transition strategy. But do we need to overcome them? Absolutely. Is it the time? Yes, it is. Are we going to deliver something out the door that's what it's going to be 10 years from now? No way. As Ryan said, we don't know that Next Generation 911 will ever fully be deployed. We're going to continue to add, continue to do things. Are we going to do them in standards-based? Absolutely. NENA, the National Emergency Number Association, is working with ADIS and ESIF, the Emergency Services Interconnect Forum, to ensure that we have standards that we deliver these applications in a manner that can be received. iPhone apps. When you build an iPhone app, you build it to a standard so it can get out to that device. When you build a 911 app, you're going to build it to a standard so it can get to that public safety answering point, so it can get out to that first responder. We've actually had talks with science and technology. I heard a P25 comment earlier, science and technology about SafeCom. And how do we get Next Generation 911 involved with SafeCom so that we can ensure we have an IP backbone that will take calls from the person who hits the button to the person who's going to answer the call? So yes, we are. Thank you very much.
Mr. Whitmer, from your perspective in the vendor community, do you expect or see that all of the other competitors or people that you work cooperatively with will be fighting to develop those standards? Will there be cooperation? I think back to whether it's P25 or Enhanced 911. The thing that worries me is that standards, for one reason or another, may be tied up in litigation for years as vendors jockey for whose standard will be adopted, or is it something that should be developed outside of the vendor community by government?
I believe it's going to be a combination of two things. One is we are working very collaboratively in the standards body. If you look at ADIS, ESIF, all of the significant players that are in this field, whether they're in the customer premise equipment side or whether they're in the network side, are all members of ADIS, ESIF to develop standards. From the National Emergency Number Association side, the same thing. All of the vendors have partners, have members that are on different committees within the NENA organization to ensure that we have standards. NENA has a program called ICE, Industry Collaboration Event, where all of the vendors get together once or twice a year, look at a specific piece of the next generation standards or solution set and determine if all their parts can work together. Then there's going to be the other part where first guy on the block is going to have some say because you're out there, you're doing it, it's working. I use the example of the wireless. The TR45.2, which is TIA standards, developed J standard 34 and J standard 36 for phase 1 and phase 2. That doesn't mean a whole lot, except neither one of those had NCAS in them. When wireless phase 1 was deployed, NCAS became a de facto standard because it allowed us to deploy more quickly with the public safety agencies without having to do all of the upgrade of equipment at the PSAP. So we could deploy it more quickly, and it became a de facto standard. Some of that will happen in this industry with Next Generation 911, but an awful lot of it today is being driven out of the standards bodies. The IP interface to the PSAP to the equipment in the PSAP is a standard that came out of ESIF, the Emergency Services Interconnect Forms, called RFAI, Request for Assistance. There are some standards for data transfer that came out of there. Emergency Services Message Interface, ESME and EASY, and those kind of things to be able to move data back and forth. Those will become they will morph as we have more capability, but right now they're at least something that we can develop too. Well, I must have done a really good job.
Thank you
Either
very
that
much.
or everyone's tired. Thank you very much.
Thank you very
Thank
much. Do we have public comments? Okay, since we have no public comments, I don't think we'll take the 15-minute break, if that's okay with the panel. Okay. I'd like to thank our panel today. Ryan Doolin, Chief Reginald Chappelle, Retired Police Chief Sam Spiegel, Shasta County Sheriff Tom Bosanko, Reading Fire Chief Kevin Craitman. Oh, good. I'd also like to thank our presenters, Thomas Jeffers, Jeremy Smith, Ryan Doolin, Joy Willis, and Gerald Whitmer. I'd like to thank all the participants in the room today. I'm glad that you showed up to hear us. This is a very, very important topic to the state of California. I'd like to remind everybody on our meeting notice, if you don't have it, it's posted on the website, www.cio.ca.gov. There are 15 questions that we'd like to get responses to. These meetings and the questionnaire really is to seek out information and make sure that we are going down the right path. I'd like to thank the City of Reading for allowing us to use this wonderful facility. It's been a very nice place to have this meeting. We have 5 more meetings to go. I'd like to let everybody know where they'll be. We have a meeting on Friday in Sacramento. February 28th, we will be in San Diego. February 25th, Fresno. February 28th, we'll be in San Francisco. And then March 4th, we will be in Ontario. So we're trying to cover as much of the state as we can. So with that, I'd like to adjourn, and thank you, everyone.